Hello, I have escaped to lovely Devon for the long weekend to finish writing my thesis for my master's degree. On the back end of submitting a chapter for a book that will be published later in the year. And I've been reflecting a lot on the opportunities that I've had through studying at the Glucksman Ireland House and Trinity College last summer. And I've been especially lucky to conduct interviews with a variety of personalities and diplomats from Ireland, England, and the States as source material. The intention of these conversations was purely to gather primary resources and quotes for my thesis argument. However, as it's the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement this weekend, and President Biden is embarking on a trip to Ireland in a couple of days, I thought I'd share a few of these conversations in a very informal 4-part series. Now that does mean that the quality of these conversations is not really up to standard with what I would normally like to share. So, please excuse the Wi-Fi and the sort of lacking camera and audio quality. But now that we're here, I have transcribed these chats in entirety, and I've asked permission from the contributors for the material to be both archived at NYU and released publicly. So I hope you find some of this material interesting and thought-provoking. I also hope that these interviews might be repurposed to some extent, whether that medium be for an article in the Times, an excerpt for radio or podcast. So yeah, if you have any leads on how that might be able to occur, please let me know. If you would like to use the material yourself, then all I would ask is, reach out, let me know, and of course, credit me. Yeah, I hope you enjoy. The first interview is with Ambassador Noel Fahey, who began his career in 1974 in the Foreign Service. He's had a lengthy career and has lived and served in New Delhi, Brussels, Germany, Rome, having a large active role in European affairs and economic issues. But of course, for my subject matter and my interests, it's most significant that he served as Irish ambassador to Washington between 2002 and 2007 during the Bush administration. So yeah, we had a wonderful conversation, and then there are a few more that I'll probably share in the coming weeks, but I hope you enjoy them. Please spread the message that I am looking for opportunities of publication, and thanks for listening. Well, hello. It's nice to meet you, even if over video chat. Thank you for taking the time to chat with me, and I appreciate the connection that Ambassador Mulhall has given me in this. He's a huge help with my thesis project.
Well, Dan is a good guy. I've known him for, I don't like to think how long, 40 years or more.
Yeah, no, he's been a major help in advising my project. So I can thank him for us joining together. So I have so many questions to ask you, but I know that, in being conscious of time, I may sort of skip over a few and then circle back, but we'll see how we do. Essentially, my thesis project is about the relationship between the US and Irish diplomats at 3 distinct points. So sort of the 70s, when you talk about NORAID and the troubles picking up, and then skipping to the Good Friday Agreement, and then most recently Brexit. Right. So you were saying you're from the west of Ireland.
I'm from the west of Ireland. I went to school, and both primary and secondary school locally in Roscommon. And then I came to Dublin. I did my primary degree in University College Dublin, and I also have a diploma in public administration from UCD. I worked in the civil service and joined the Department of Foreign Affairs in 1970, but I didn't stay there very long. I moved to the Department of Finance, the Treasury, where I spent 4 years. Then I moved back to Foreign Affairs in 1974. I worked in Dublin for 2 years before going to Delhi in 1976 for 4 years. I was back in Dublin again in 1980. And then I went to Brussels in 1982, where I worked in the permanent representation. That's our mission to the European Union. And basically, I worked on EU issues for most of my career, certainly from 1982 to 1998, when I went to Germany as ambassador. I was ambassador in Germany until 2002, and from 2002, summer of 2002, until the summer of 2007, in the United States in Washington, D.C. And then I finished my career. I was 4 years in Rome as ambassador to the Holy See, and I retired in June 2011.
Right.
Since I've retired, I haven't exerted myself too much. I've been on the board of Literature Ireland for 6 years. Literature Ireland is the agency that sponsors the translation of works produced in Ireland into other languages. Very interesting. I've done some consultancy work, and I'm very much involved in our Institute of European Affairs.
Right.
So there you are.
So I wanted to just chat quickly about the sort of how you used to gauge Ireland's place in the world when you were growing up, and that way we can sort of paint the picture of how much it's evolved since then. So when you were quite young, what's your memory of Ireland and the role it had on the global stage?
It's a curious thing that the Irish newspapers and the paper we used to get, because my father was a supporter of De Valera, was the Irish Press, were quite heavy on foreign news. Now, they would have relied on the international agencies, including the American agencies, for their view of the world. Also, at that time, from the mid-50s onwards, the Irish radio station, particularly, paid a fair amount of attention to foreign news. I mean, I have a very vivid memory, for instance, and I would have been about 9 at the time, of the Russians, the Soviets invading Hungary, time of the Hungarian uprising. And I also have a vivid memory of the British and French expedition, if you can call it that now, to the Suez Canal in 1956. So I have a memory of, even though I grew up in rural Ireland, of a childhood that wasn't at all unaware of what was going on in the outside world.
Right.
And of course, the mid-50s coincided with Ireland finally acceding to the United Nations, and certainly our membership of the UN in the early years, so that would be up to the early 60s, was a big story. And there were issues in the Congo expedition, the Congo peacekeeping expedition would have something that was certainly a couple year. So yeah, I was interested in external affairs, if you like to call it, foreign policy at an early age. I'll mention one other thing. The area I grew up in was an area with strong of emigration to the United States. A number of relatives in the US. My mother's favorite cousin was a chaplain in the US Air Force who used to pop up unexpectedly quite often in uniform, which when I think about it now surprised me. Because he'd hitch a ride on a flight transiting Shannon and come up. Shannon wasn't that far away. The brother of one of my classmates was in the US Air Force. He was killed in a training accident. I remember the funeral. So there was, and Time magazine was a pretty constant feature, as was the Reader's Digest. So America wasn't that far away in that sense. Nearer, of course.
Yeah, I mean, for it's kind of funny because for me, when I was growing up, there was this sense of my parents are from Ireland. I'd spend summers in Barna and Galway, and yeah, gorgeous. And I understood the sort of perception of America through perhaps an Irish person's eyes, but then vice versa. In America, there was a bit of I suppose you could call it sort of cultural animation, like a romanticized version of Ireland. And I think some academics refer to this as theme parking,
Yeah.
where you've got A Quiet Man, that film from 1953.
Yes, I know. I remember when
John Hind photographs that were turned into postcards, and this idea of like the red-haired leprechaun. Do you remember sort of? Do you have any memory of that as time was moving on, and how Ireland was perceived from the outside world?
Not really. I remember The Quiet Man. I remember my parents going to it in the early 50s. But America wasn't. Sorry, just excuse me. I just want to press the switch here before we lose power. America was not. Oh, sorry. I said to the. I just said.
That's okay.
The trouble with double plugs is they have double switches, and you can easily press the wrong one. Anyway, I've made sure we won't be disconnected. I don't think, maybe because my mother had two brothers in the US and my father had uncles in the US, and there was very regular contact. I don't think we had a particularly romantic view of the US. And I'm not sure, perhaps my relatives did, but no, I certainly I didn't grow up in the Quiet Man. Much
I
as
don't
I
think
like
anybody
Kong,
did.
actually, now that I come to think of it, I remember as a small child that we actually went to Kong while they were filming it.
Oh wow.
Exchanged recently with Ernie O'Malley's son about the price of sandwiches in the hotel in Kong when they were making the movie, and how the demand from the crew had put up the price of sandwiches. But
right.
no, there was the Darby O'Gill and the Little People film, but no, I don't think we're particularly bothered by that image.
Yeah.
Because we knew there was a real America out there.
Of course. Yeah. One to be explored by so many in the coming decades. How do you define soft power? I've been using the term for the sake of my research, Joseph Nye's term about sort of persuasion, the ability to move people by argument, but also the ability to attract. How would you define it?
Sorry. Could you just hold on just one moment? Hello? Hi, can I call you later? I'm just on something at the moment and I'll give you a shout. Okay. Okay, bye-bye. Bye. Sorry, Molly, let me kill this so that I don't get interrupted again. Sorry, soft power. It's looking at what advantages you have in terms of influencing others. It's something that's particularly important for a small country like Ireland. The obvious thing in America is the connection with Irish America, and that we've used or tried to use ever since independence, arguably before going back to the Fenians and even back to the Young Irelanders. That's one side of it, but there are other aspects: culture, using your cultural assets, the English language in our case, because we share a language with a very large part of the world, not just with our water. An odd thing in its time, religion, less so now, much less. And also using the fact that because we're, in Ireland's case, we're relatively small, so we're quite small, and we're not really a threat, and that can be useful in terms of, acting as a go-between, being seen as a reliable interlocutor. There are many components to soft power, and I don't think you can define them have a single definition. For instance, the US is a great power, certainly. It has plenty of hard power, but the soft power of, uh, for instance, America's role in English literature, for instance, that's soft power. The strong cultural assets that the United States has in theatre and music. You can find an element of soft power in practically every country in the world, and it's a question of how you use it, how you marshal it.
Right. Yeah.
And it's important. I mean, yeah.
Sorry. I think you've sort of touched on how the definition can differ, whether you're looking at it from a more philosophical scope or academic. But when you entered foreign service, I believe you said it was 1974. What was the culture of diplomacy for Ireland at that time, and how did it touch on soft power?
I wouldn't say that it touched very much on soft power in my case. It was there in the background, but the area I dealt with was Europe, and that was an area of pretty well hard-nosed negotiation, because in those days, particularly, the European Union was an economic union, and you had to fight your corner. I can't say, certainly in my first posting and then later on in the 80s, I was as conscious of soft power as perhaps seeing how we could persuade other countries to come along with us. And it was a question not of soft power, it's a question of what you could trade, support here, support there. I wouldn't say it was a particular issue for me for much of my career in the 70s and 80s, except in India, where there were two elements that were important: the common heritage of British colonialism and having had to live under it, which gave us a common kind of lexicon in many ways, and of course the English language. And certainly culture and soft power was important there, insofar as India was important to us then, which it wasn't really in the broader context of Irish foreign policy, because India at the time was extremely autarkic, and wasn't encouraging investment, wasn't encouraging trade, and had put an end to the presence of missionaries from outside India. So even that element, which had been quite strong, was fading away. But yes, soft power would have been around when I was in India, but not. I wouldn't have said so all that much in my years dealing with the European Union. Now, of course, I was well aware of the importance of the relationship with the United States and the role of Irish America when it came to the North and the whole Northern crisis, which was playing separately. Not that I got very much involved in it, but it was playing separately. It was very big. I couldn't not be aware of it.
Right. So when it came to the European Union and sort of post accession, what were some of the tactics that led to successful collaboration with foreign diplomats?
Well, you built up alliances. If you take the area I was dealing with for much of the 70s, for the 70s, and again quite a bit in the 80s and 90s, it was a question of finding allies. Say if you had an issue with trying to get Brussels to increase the amount of resources that it devoted to the support of the outlying regions, of which Ireland was certainly one and still is in a way, but in a particular way in those days. You built alliances with Greece, with Spain and Portugal, with other countries that had similar concerns. If it were agriculture products, it was almost a bit like being. This occurs to me actually, and a good analogy. I remember at the height of the Greek crisis, John Kenneth Galbraith's son, who was a professor, I think, in Austin, and who was a close friend of Varoufakis, Greek foreign minister, finance minister, came to Dublin to lecture us on the iniquities of negotiating in Brussels. and he described the complexity, and he mentioned in passing when introducing himself that had worked as an assistant to a congressman on Capitol Hill in his younger days. And it occurred to me that if you wanted a comparison with trying to get your way in Brussels, horse trading and so on, you could do an awful lot worse than pick the example of trying to get things done in the House of Representatives. I refrained from saying that to him because he had obviously decided that Europe really wasn't at all as efficient as the US system on Capitol Hill. He'd obviously forgotten a lot.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I guess not much has changed in that regard.
No, in either place.
Do you remember a kind of legacy left on the US front with Ireland as it pertained to people like the Four Horsemen or other people in Congress that were sort of making moves perhaps more efficiently?
Of course I do. I mean, I just go back to what we were discussing about my background and what I remember from that. The one element I should have mentioned, which I didn't, was of course John Fitzgerald Kennedy's election in 1960. I spent the summer of 1960 not in Barna, but much further out in Carna, and the people I stayed with, I was there to learn Irish. The couple I stayed with had lived their formative years in Boston, and clearly Kennedy's run for the presidency, and this would have been July 1960, was very much on their minds. I must say the man of the house was slightly more cynical about Kennedy's than his wife, but that might well have reflected how people felt in Boston at the same time. I'm not sure. So the role of Ted Kennedy, which goes back to 1972, was always a big, it was something of which I would have been conscious even in the department, and even if I wasn't dealing with the US, I would certainly have been conscious of the role of the Four Horsemen of Hugh Carey and the others in that connection of Tip O'Neill. And yes, Irish America in that sense would have been there in the background. I mean, I wouldn't have been hearing it all that much because it didn't really begin to affect me until I came to the States in 2002. But yes, I knew it was there.
So what always strikes me is this ability that Ireland has had to create allyships, like you mentioned, within the European Union and elsewhere. But you have to wonder what's their bargaining chip, because I think, especially, well, in terms of Brexit, especially when you're thinking backing Ireland as opposed to Britain, which obviously can provide a lot more sort of hard power, a larger economic market. There seems to be more that people would be enticed by, and yet Ireland prevails.
Yeah, well, we prevail. We'll wait and see, because Brexit is a chapter that's going to run for a long time yet, I'm afraid. But just to go back on that, in Europe, basically, I always argued, and I was head of the European Department for 5 years. You have to pick your moment, you have to pick your fight, you have to make sure that if you're going to go all out to get what you want on an issue, you really will only have one issue every so often. So you have to be very careful. And you have to make sure that it's an issue of common concern. I mean, in the case of Brexit would be seen by the other member states as having a particular impact on us. Yeah. And there would be an anxiety there to make sure that a member state is not put at a single member state is not put at a particular disadvantage. And in an alliance, people rally around. I'm sure also there was a hard-headed calculation made in Berlin and in Paris and elsewhere, but particularly in Berlin and Paris, as to the extent to which their own interests might be damaged by giving the British the deal that they wanted, in other words, cake and nothing else, and demanding nothing else from them. And they would not have been willing to sacrifice another member state for that, because the impact, not just on the solidarity with that member state, but from other member states who felt they might find themselves in the same position further on, that would have been there. The Greeks would have asked themselves, well, what if there's an issue with the Turks, where if the Baltic countries would have asked themselves, what if there's an issue with the Russians? And let's not forget, the EU is showing very considerable solidarity with the Balts at the moment. So I don't want to romanticize one for all for one. There's a large selfish element in what happens to us today might happen to you tomorrow. There's that element in it.
Yeah.
And there, perhaps I don't understand Brexit. I still don't understand it. I thought, I have to say, that it was very likely once Cameron said there was going to be a referendum. But once it happened, and here we are, we still have it, and people are accusing each other of treason now in London because it's the truth.
Yeah, mad times to be studying the subject matter. It is. I mean, it's posed challenges just in the sense that it is so contemporary that the data and the consequences aren't fully realized yet. But very interesting. Can I?
Sorry, no, go ahead.
After you. What was your note there?
Yeah. What you haven't asked about the support we've had from the United States. Now, I'm not in the game anymore, and I haven't been in the game as far as Washington is concerned since 2007. And I am well aware that an awful lot happens that never quite gets out into the public. So, I mean, I'm relying, and I have been relying, certainly for the last decade, on what I read in the public prints. But it occurs to me that we sometimes forget the European Union exists, and thanks to the United States, it follows from the logic of the Marshall Plan and Washington's anxiety in the 50s that there should not be a revival of the Franco-German rivalry, and that as far as possible the European countries should work together on the economy, yes, but also politically. Now, the US wouldn't, for obvious, and de Gaulle didn't exactly help things, wasn't prepared to share the responsibility for defense with the European Union. But certainly, from the economic point of view, it was very much. It did take a very big interest in the EEC and later in the EU. There's a document, I don't have it to hand, but you'll find it if you can check on the latest volume of the documents on Irish foreign policy. Sometime in 1968, the ambassador in Washington reported on a conversation he had with George Ball, and Ball pretty well told the ambassador that he didn't really think Ireland were suitable for membership of the EEC. Now, here's an American official telling an Irish official that Ireland is not suitable for membership of an organisation of which neither at the time are members, but on which the Americans took a proprietary interest.
Yeah.
And I would say since we joined, there have been many occasions of tension and conflict over trade between Washington and Brussels. And yet, when I was head of the European department in the ministry, in foreign affairs in the 1990s, we would have a visit from the US Embassy before every General Affairs Council to tell us what the European position was. So if you wanted to say that the US was the 29th member of the EEC or the EU, in a way it was. It took that much interest.
Yeah. It actually sort of goes on to my
Sorry, just to complete that.
yes.
That is to make the point that it's not just because Joe Biden is proud and conscious of his Irish background. Much more to the point, I would imagine Washington are much more conscious of the importance of a united Western Europe or EU, and it's undermining by the departure of the British. It's not particularly welcome from a practical point of view and from the point of view of US interests.
Yeah. It sort of connects to my next point, which is just to ask you about the role the Irish diaspora has played. Of course, 35 million in America, huge portion of voting population. How have they swayed American interference over time?
You're much more, being a part of it, you're much more conscious of what it is to be an Irish American. And you're also conscious that Irish Americans come in all shapes and sizes, all sorts of traditions.
Of course.
You have, if you want to stretch it back, you have the Scots-Irish who went in the 18th century, and whose links would be, ironically, with Northern Ireland and not so much with the South. And then you have it right up to those who went in the 19th century, increasingly the Catholics, increasingly Catholic America. And you would have that immigration tapering off, certainly by the end of by the mid-50s, if not a good deal sooner. In fact, you could say that Irish immigration to the United States peaked in the 1890s. So if you go from that and ask yourself, you use the figure of 35 million. I've used it myself, and indeed on occasion we've used the figure of 40 million. But in fact, you're talking about Americans who are most of whom are vaguely conscious of their Irish connections. So, and the majority of whom are most conscious of it on day, but otherwise are Americans. And the important thing to remember, for the vast majority of Irish Americans, what's important is American interest, not Irish interest. And you make a mistake if you ask them to prejudice US interests, because they won't, and they never have. I mean, you can take that going back to pre-independence. What has always been important for Irish America, first and foremost, is American interest. But leaving that aside, they are prepared to rally when there is a serious issue. And that's where, and again, it's a bit like when you want to win a battle in Brussels, you need to pick your point, your issue. And the issue for the last 40 years has been peace in the North. And to that extent, Irish America is with you. It will have its own views, by the way. And this is the other, what I find interesting aspect is, if Irish America has a romantic view of Ireland, Ireland has a particular view of Irish America, which, for instance, that Irish Americans are all Catholic, that Irish Americans always vote Democrat. They don't, as you will find out pretty quickly if you talk to your relatives, speaking in my own case, that Irish America would support liberal immigration reform. It doesn't. And it's always an issue, of course, for the embassy in Washington to try and explain to Dublin where America is coming from, because, as we know, everybody in Ireland understands America and knows it very well.
Yeah.
Better than the embassy sometimes.
I suppose, do you think partisanship gets in the way of progress of that relationship? Because we've seen, with it's actually, funnily enough, stemming from the sort of Scots-Irish and Ulster, that's almost the foundation for a lot of the Trump Americans in the middle of the country, and there is that connection there. So, I mean,
there is, yes, I agree with you.
Or do you think it doesn't matter because we've got people like Mick Mulvaney who now can step up and sort of share that passion for Ireland and Ireland's role going forward?
I have to be careful here because I'm only speaking of my own experience in Washington. I want to be very careful and not to offer an opinion based on what happened, or a very definite opinion, at least, based on what happened in the years since I left. But I
Sure.
have to say, when I was in Washington, there was a very close bipartisanship. Pete King, to take the obvious example, but right across the Jim Walsh, who was congressman from upstate New York and Syracuse, there was a strong bipartisanship, and that certainly continued for the 5 years I was there.
Right.
I have to say, I didn't come across. I can't think of an example where there was partisan, and I'm talking about the peace process and those issues. I'm not talking about immigration reform. I mean, immigration
Right.
reform was a more difficult, much touchier subject and presented a much bigger challenge, both for bipartisanship, but also for the views of individual members of Congress, because it wasn't always popular. It wasn't universally popular. You can go back to that later if you want to. But looking at it from the point of view of the peace process, I have to say that in Congress, there was unstinting support across the aisle.
Right. Yeah, can you actually just speak a little bit about the atmosphere of your department in the lead up to the Good Friday Agreement and the peace negotiations?
Well, I wasn't involved in the Good Friday negotiations. I was on the outside. I mean, I was on the outside in the sense I was elsewhere. I was chasing issues in Brussels, which, from a day-to-day point of view, were equally important, perhaps from the point of view of people in the South, more important, and also had a northern element. But I was aware, because at that stage I was on the management committee of the department, I was aware of the complexity of the negotiations, and I was aware of the growing mood in '97, coming into '98, that agreement was likely. I was also aware of an increased interest, but in Brussels, a commitment. Well, the Brussels commitment to peace in the North has been as strong as the American commitment, even though it sometimes doesn't get as much attention.
Right.
I was aware of, it was delicate. People kept their cards close to their chests, even within the department. It was a very delicate negotiation, but there was a feeling that this time there is going to be something. And I heard a lot that was positive about George Mitchell, just in
Yeah,
but I wouldn't claim to be an expert on it. And I know where I was when they had the final breakthrough. I was down in my wife's family farm in South Tipperary on Good Friday with the kids when the news came through.
No, you remember where you were. That's
But I do remember where I was. Yes.
Yeah. Well, jumping sort of ahead to your term as ambassador in the US, I suppose sort of can you walk me through sort of what your priorities were? Who were you communicating with on a day-to-day basis?
I was a little bit surprised to be, of course, very happy to be tapped to go to Washington. My previous experience, including my ambassadorial experience, was in Europe. I had an interesting and amusing chat with my American colleague when I arrived in Germany on Kornblum. He had been, it was unusual, he was the first career ambassador to be appointed to Germany since the foundation of the Federal Republic. And I remember going to see him in the embassy. We were still in Bonn at the time, and he said to me, he said, I opposed. He had been an assistant secretary of state, secretary in the State Department before coming to Bonn, and he said, he said, I opposed the idea of giving Gerry Adams a visa, but he said it was the right decision by President Clinton in the end. But and I mean, America was always not just in the background, was there or there. It was always a very big issue in Germany. And we had the Bosnian crisis at the time. And of course, we had 9/11. I was in Berlin on 9/11. And again, I can remember where I was when it didn't come in on the wire. My wife phoned me from home to say, you better put on the television. There's been there's a terrible incident in New York. And I
I
remember
was 2 blocks away in the closest
sorry?
elementary school to the site.
Yeah. Oh dear. Oh. Well, I remember there was a memorial service held at the Brandenburg Gate about a week later, and there was a huge crowd there. And Berlin was a city, especially the West, which had a particular affinity with the US because they would have remembered that it was the US that stood between West Berlin and the tyranny for the best part of 4 decades. But when I arrived in Washington, I benefited greatly from the good work done by my predecessor. Now, that's true, I think, for every ambassador. But Sean O'Higgins, who had a very deep involvement in the peace process and in the North, going back to the 70s, who had been Consul General in New York, had a particular expertise in America and a particular expertise in the peace process. And he had done a lot to if you like, persuade the Bush administration that they needed to take an interest in Northern Ireland. And he had succeeded by the time I got there. So I arrived to a very well prepared ground, for which I was very grateful for the 5 years I was there. Now, when I got there, what was of interest to me, given my past background, was the relationship with the EU, the US relationship with the EU, because we had a presidency of the Council of Ministers of the EU coming up in 2004. So that was important for my view, and I assume was one of the reasons why I was sent to Washington. Obviously, the peace process and supporting it, and immigration reform, which it may seem odd, given the numbers involved and given the issue involved. But that is, as you would know, having a connection on the west coast of Ireland, that is important for the politicians who have west coast connections. Might be less important in the east. It's certainly important in Donegal, Mayo, parts of Galway, my own country to some extent.
Okay.
And they would have been the 3 issues. Reaching out to the Irish community, of course, but that goes without saying.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I wonder how the Celtic Tiger created any kind of shift in value placement, and obviously with Ireland being a much more prosperous country at that time, did it mean it was more attractive to sort of foreign investment and tourism and all that kind of thing?
Well, you're right to touch on that, and that was the 4th issue, which I should have mentioned. Is of course the boom was really getting underway from 2002 onwards. Surprising, because there was a feeling that 9/11 would set things back, but it did, but only very briefly, economically. And for the economic consensus that existed at the time, Ireland was certainly very much a poster boy. There was, and of course it still is, very big US investment in Ireland. And I have to say, I was lucky enough the 5 years I was there that the investment flowed, that the relationship was very smooth. There were the occasional rows more with the EU than with Ireland about trade issues, but they were generally smoothed over. I was lucky that I was in Washington for a period of good relations between the US and Europe, and good relations between the US and Ireland. And at a time when people wanted to talk to Ireland about its economic success, so, you were popular You were welcome. Ireland was doing well, and people felt good about that more broadly in America, because rightly they regarded American investment as playing a major part in that.
Right.
So,
sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
So I wonder, I suppose it's a bit more of a personal question, but as ambassador in the US at that time, what was something that you took away, like a lesson you took away from that posting, and also something that you might have been very proud of accomplishing at the time?
uh, well, what I was proud of was the good relationship we had with the Bush administration. Now, I know Sean O'Higgins had laid the foundations, but it had to be worked on. And it was felt by many people in the US and by a lot of people in Ireland, because the Republicans, the Irish, have this view that the party that takes the most interest in Ireland is the Democrats, and you have to try and get over that, because it's not, in fact, the case.
Right.
That the Bush administration would not be particularly or helpful. But George Bush was unstinting in his support for the peace process. His Richard Haas, Mitchell Reese, who were the two leading figures in terms of the content of the State Department, both played a very important part in helping things along as flesh was put on the bones of the Good Friday Agreement through those long and interminable negotiations in the first half of the 2000s. And what I was proud of was keeping that going, dealing with issues as they came up, making sure that people continued to take an interest. And one thing sticks in my mind: the practice in Washington is just before Christmas, the heads of mission get invited to Blair House by the chief of protocol for a Christmas drink and good wishes. And it's never mentioned, but it's always known that the president will come by. And in 2007, 2006, I was on my fourth of these events. And what happens, the president comes in, is on a dais with the secretary and the first lady, and he says the usual kind words, wishing everybody a happy Christmas and thanking the diplomatic corps for the hard work it's doing, and the usual useful words. And then he shakes hands there's a rope walk, and he shakes hands with ambassadors, most of whom, no doubt, won't see him from one end of the ear to the other in the flesh, and make the best of this moment with him. And I kind of stood back. I'd been there for 4 years, and he reached across about 2 rows and he pulled me in. Now there are 200 ambassadors in Washington, and he would see me maybe twice in the White House for the rest of the year, direct, close up. And I was very impressed that he remembered me and pulled me in. And there was a tricky, which was around about the time of the St. Andrews Agreement, and there was a tricky issue that he had pushed, that the Bush administration had pushed with the British. And he did this. He said, we came this close, we'll do it the next time. So the idea that George Bush was indifferent to Ireland and indifferent to the peace process and indifferent to the negotiations was wrong. He took an interest. That was very encouraging. That certainly pleased me. It's one thing I'm proud.
No, it's a lovely story.
Yeah, I mean, it's very rewarding to be Irish ambassador in Washington. If anybody who's done the job tells you they didn't like it, they're not telling you the truth. It's great. It's great. One of the things about being Irish ambassador to the United States is people will generally return your calls. So because they will have a connection.
Right. A connection. And do you think that just, I think, a final note, because I am conscious of your time, but that connection, I mean, it's a simple enough statement just to say they'll always take your calls if you're the Irish ambassador, but that connection, it sort of, it goes beyond heritage and family ties. I think it's this sort of universal feeling that Irish culture and Irish people, well, it would transcend all parts of the world and touch all sort of corners
But
of the world.
it's certainly true. It's certainly true in the United States, partly because we do have, to a certain extent, a common culture through a common language. So it's no accident that Yeats is so widely quoted by Americans, or that Joyce is such a well-known writer in the US, and that
Right.
Irish writers, well, that normal people, for instance, of all things,
Yeah.
my daughter's college should appeal not only to my grandchildren in Edinburgh, but also to so many Americans. But the other thing about this is I could get my calls taken, but Americans are hard-headed, and my story better be a good one if I was going to do much more than get the call taken. I mean,
Yeah.
people might be polite, but you have to have a story, and you have to have something that stands up, and you have something to sell. And my great regret is that the attempt by Ted Kennedy and John McCain to reform the immigration regime didn't succeed. But it was a reminder, had we known at the time, of a very difficult issue that was going to create more and more problems as time went on from then on. And, you know, in the end, played a very important part in the election of President Trump. I would imagine, I wasn't there, but I would imagine it was an important part of it.
I think I'll leave it there, because as you say,
before you go, can I ask you about yourself? You mentioned that you have Galway connections.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, my mom was actually born in Dublin, grew up in Stepaside, but when she was about 20, my grandparents moved to Galway, where my granddad is from originally, grew up in Salt Hill.
Well, then we have that in common. My grandparents, my grandfather was from not from that side, but from near Loughrea, and from the other side.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, yes. So that's sort of when I go back to Ireland now, it's certainly home. I usually try to fly into Dublin on the weekend to see the cousins and family friends, and then to spend the week with my pop and Dee in Barna. And then my dad was by luck born in the States, moved back to Ireland with the family when he was 3, and was raised in Port Arlington. Went to Newtown boarding school, and then went to Trinity. So. Yeah, I mean, then of course, moving over to the States, I was born their only child, and spent a lot of my time either in Ireland or in the sort of satellite Irish community that was New York. And now they own bars and restaurants all over Manhattan. Some well known, like the Dead Rabbit and Swift Pub and Pier A Harbor House. So, you know, growing up in that very Irish hospitality sort of community, it's no wonder I finally went back for the master's degree and chose Irish studies, because it's something I've always been passionate about, but never really had the chance to explore, being in an American school my whole life. So yeah, and now I'm living in London, but that's not as far from Galway, although it does take quite a long time by the time you get into Dublin and then take the Go bus across. It might as well be flying to America.
Yeah, it's a pity the airport in Galway didn't thrive. It would have made life a lot easier. My son worked in the library in UCG for about 5 years, and used to visit his sister in Edinburgh at a time when there was actually a direct flight from Galway to Edinburgh by Air Ireland.
Oh, right.
So it just shows that not every air link, despite Ryanair, has thrived. Yeah, that's interesting. So you do have a very up-to-date connection with Ireland. It's not strange to you.
No, not at all. I often feel more Irish than American, I think, just given how close I am with my family, how much time. I've been very lucky. I know other kids who have Irish parents who've only visited once or twice in their life, and I've spent summers, you know, up until basically university growing up in Galway, and I treasure it. It's very important to me. So
yeah, Galway is a very nice place. I'm from Roscommon, and of course Galway was
yeah,
my I have Galway connections, not the city but the county, and anyway where I lived was only 6 miles from the Galway border, but
yeah.
yeah, that's your father was in Trinity. You haven't been in Trinity yourself.
Yeah, I always thought about it for undergrad and even for the grad application. But what was really lovely about NYU and the Glucksman program is I got to study for a summer and finish my credits at Trinity. So this past summer, I spent June and July in Botany Bay dorms, and I was placed by a complete coincidence in the exact same room as my dad, but one floor below his old dorm. So it was very surreal moment. Of course, when they came to visit, they acknowledged it had been renovated a few times since they were there.
I'm sure,
Yeah.
I'm sure it has. I leave you with the thought that my granddaughter, who's in Edinburgh, who's 16, made sure this summer that she visited on her own, that she visited Trinity, so that she was able to relish the normal people experience.
Yeah. That is quite a draw now. I do see a lot more people walking around the grounds sort of after that book was published.
Indeed.
But
okay,
thank
Molly,
you so much. This has been wonderful,
thank you.
and I appreciate you taking the time. It
Not
means
at
a
all.
lot.
It's a pleasure, and good luck with your studies, and good luck in the future.
Yeah, hopefully we'll see you around New York around the circuit sometime.
I'm afraid I've been disgracefully remiss on the States. I haven't been back. Having gone to Europe, I tend to spend my holidays in Europe rather than go that way. I'm going to Austria.
I do feel a bit of the same. Where are you calling from today?
I'm calling from Dublin, but I'm going to Austria I'm fixing up a holiday in Austria in May, cycling actually.
Okay.
Do a bit of.
Lovely.
Anyway, take care, and best wishes
Yes.
to New York, and
Thank
good
you
luck
so
with your
much.
studies.
Okay, we'll chat to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.